Hi, everyone. I'm Jill Aiotoro, Editor-in-Chief of SC Media and Editorial Director at Cyber Risk Alliance. I want to first thank you for joining us for today's Secure Cloud eSummit. And I want to introduce our next keynote session, Security as Code, the only way to protect your business in the cloud. I'm going to be speaking to James Kaplan, partner with McKinsey & Company, working out of the New York office. He led the cyber practice at McKinsey for many years and currently chairs its Technology Knowledge Committee and co-leads the Cloud Initiative. He and I are going to be chatting about this technique of policies driving secure configuration programmatically. James, thanks so much for being here with us today. I really appreciate it.
Delighted to be chatting with you. It's always a lot of fun to talk about cloud security.
Yes, and there's lots to talk about these days.
Exactly so. It's a challenging yet fascinating topic, one of the more dynamic ones in the enterprise technology world.
Oh yeah, especially today, just when we think we figure something out every
Yeah, exactly so.
So to start, explain this concept to me of security as code.
Well, tell you what, why don't I back up a little bit and explain the problem, that security as code solves, which is that many traditional security architectures and operating models don't work as well in the cloud. So, traditionally over 30 years, we've built up security models where in many cases, the security team checks things. They perform application security reviews. They provide advice to application development teams. They configure things, whether it's firewalls or anything else, based on requests that they receive from application development teams. And in many cases, they're depending on the existence of a traditional perimeter. None of that works terribly well in the cloud for a couple of reasons. A, you can't rely on a traditional perimeter. B, the reason that people want to go to the cloud is for speed and agility. Mm-hmm. And if you have to wait on a security team doing something or checking something, you don't have the massive business acceleration that in many cases is causing companies to adopt cloud platforms and cloud architectures. In addition, architectures in the cloud are complex. The exciting thing about cloud is all the capabilities that it provides. But as a result, there's dozens upon dozens of services that companies can consume and many, many different ways of configuring those services and integrating them together, some of which may be secure and many of which may be not. And we've found, and we've looked at this a lot, that almost all the vulnerabilities and breaches in the cloud we've found result not from some sort of technical compromise of the CSP services, but from misconfiguration, from an enterprise setting up their cloud environment the wrong way. And given the complexity, that's a really easy thing to do if you let developers do it manually, or even if you let infrastructure teams or cloud engineering teams do it manually. So the idea behind security as code is to define a set of policies programmatically. This type of data needs to be encrypted at rest in the cloud, and then using automation to ensure that that policy is always implemented at the time of provisioning, and in addition that you can interrogate your existing environment for continued adherence to that policy, that you can interrogate it to prevent drift.
Okay, so it's interesting you mentioned that configuration problems are really the primary, cause of breaches. I know we report about this all the time, and that's certainly.
I would say primary, almost to the point of only.
Yeah.
I mean, you never want to say only, but it's darn near close to only.
I'm not going to name it, but there was one in the last week that was a complete exception, and the main story we wrote about it was everyone was shocked that it was not.
That it was, yeah. I mean, nothing is nothing is ever 100% true in enterprise technology, given the variety of companies and the variety of technologies and the variety of configurations. But that's pretty darn close to entirely true.
So one question is, does this concept or this approach help those? Because I will also say there was a rapid adoption of cloud because of the pandemic, because of work from home, all of these sorts of scenarios. Is there any going back and filling the gaps for those individuals that did not necessarily take the care to check all the boxes properly? And so
there has to be.
Yeah.
Right. Yes, the easiest thing to do is say, okay, going forward,
right,
we're going to provision things the right way. We're going to provision things the secure way. But many companies have at least some quote unquote cloud legacy, existing cloud environments that may have been set up in a manual way. And when we go and look at those environments and test them against typical vulnerabilities, we often find significant vulnerabilities, things not being encrypted, access control set up the wrong way, what have you. And assuming that you've done important things in the cloud, it's critical for companies to go back and take a look and figure out how to remediate those environments.
Mm-hmm. So much of what you described when you first kind of spoke about the problem also reminded me about the challenges that we often hear about DevOps in terms of there's almost this clash of cultures of security wanting to ensure the data and the networks are protected, developers often wanting to innovate and innovate fast. It's a similar dynamic here in terms of the challenges. So is there, are there problems or challenges sometimes ensuring that everyone is working off that same playbook, that everyone is in agreement,
I think, and I would expand DevOps to DevSecOps.
Yeah.
But I would say security as a code is a way to reconcile the interests and the needs of the development team, the infrastructure team, and the security team. I remember the very first meeting, or one of the very first meetings I was in about DevOps. This was before even anybody used the term DevSecOps. This was probably a decade ago or more. And somebody at one of my clients was describing their ideas about DevOps. And one of the developers looked at the person presenting and said, my God, this is fantastic. It's like going back to the 1990s. We're going to give developers access to production again. And, the person said, no, that's not what we intended.
The security people went, no.
Yeah, I don't even think the security people were in the room. But if they had been, they would have been hiding underneath the table or underneath their chairs. Here's how I look about it. You need to think about a buy side and a sell side of DevSecOps. And the sell side is the creation of a set of APIs often as part of a CI/CD tool chain or development tool chain that provides for the provisioning of a cloud environment in a secure way and provides access to certain security tools like vulnerability scanning. And then you have the buy side. Often these people are SREs who are co-located or attached to development teams who consume these APIs in the process of constructing systems that leverage the cloud in a secure and a consistent way. And that way, you're giving a lot of control to the development teams about when things get done, when things get promoted to production, what have you, but you're putting guardrails around the configuration. So if you want a certain type of data, for example, always encrypted at rest, it has to be encrypted at rest, given policy and given the APIs that the SREs or the development teams are consuming.
Yeah. And you mentioned automation, and I imagine for this to really be efficient and effective, a degree of automation definitely needs to be incorporated. So what kind of, how do you develop the balance? I imagine that is a sort of a customization all unto itself, depending on the enterprise.
Well, I mean, there's a couple of ways, there's a couple of things that are important. The first of which is, I would say, the transition to a product model within security and within IT more broadly, or infrastructure more broadly. And you start to think about a series of products that infrastructure and security can provide to the development team and to the rest of the business for identity and access management, or server provisioning, or vulnerability scanning, or data provisioning and data management and what have you, that are where the security is built in. And then you have product owners for each of these products who are responsible for understanding the needs of their customers, who are often development teams, and building a backlog that will meet the development team's requirements over time. And this is a very different skill set. Most people in security or infrastructure organizations have not learned how to be product managers over time, and have not learned how to build how to groom a backlog for an agile development process. Related to that, you need to think about what the product model is and how far up the stack you'll define the products. And many companies, you start with products that are more primitive or more further down in the stack, and you depend more on the development teams to assemble them. Then over time, as there's more alignment on an architectural direction, there are standard patterns and platforms that the development teams can consume that are more pre-configured. They're more loosely grained services that are built out of lower level products. And then finally, this is a radical change in the way you think about the skills in the infrastructure and also in the security organization. Most people in security organizations are not developers. Some of them are engineers, but the engineering is thought of as let's integrate this tool, or let's implement this tool, as opposed to there's a certain type of developer experience we're aiming for. And just as customers have customer journeys, developers have developer journeys, and therefore we are going to figure out how to engineer a terrific, or a developer journey with a terrific experience from a security standpoint.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you mentioned the various products that are involved. How much is this reliant solely on the enterprise itself and its own teams or its own managed service partners, so to speak? And how much involves establishing specific policies in cooperation with your vendor partners?
By vendor partners, you mean the cloud service providers or your system integrators?
Both, I suppose.
Well, because it's very different.
Yeah.
And generally speaking, the cloud service providers operate very differently from outsourcers. They do not define policies with you.
Yep.
It's up to you as a consumer to define policy. They provide you products in most cases. Yes, they now have some professional services organization, but they provide you a set of services which you can consume in adherence with your policies or not. For example, if you store something in a cloud data store, the cloud service provider doesn't know necessarily whether that's marketing collateral or proprietary pricing information. They have no, how do they know whether you want everyone in the world to have access to this data, or you want almost nobody, either outside or inside your company, to have access to this data, which is why so many of the vulnerabilities and breaches are the result of configuration issues. So I would suggest that the policy decisions are incumbent on the enterprise. And then they need to then enterprises need to think through, okay, for different services, what exactly do they have to do in order to make those policies reality? Because quite honestly, the further up the stack you consume cloud services, the more the cloud service provider will do for you. You get more security built in with a serverless offering than you would if you were buying bare metal virtual machines.
Yeah, absolutely. So we hear about this concept of secure by design. So where does this play? Where does this fit? Are they totally different? Do they work together?
I would describe security as code as an instantiation or an implementation of security by design. So security by design, to my interpretation, means you build something so it's inherently secure.
Yeah.
Whether it's a cloud system or anything else. So necessarily, if you construct an architecture that's secure by design, you use security as code, as policy as code, to make sure that's implemented in a way that's consistent with your secure by design architectural principles.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. It also seems, I always find secure by design interesting because it's great in concept. I have to imagine it's incredibly difficult in execution.
Well, it depends on the quality of the architects and the engineers you have.
Yeah.
And one thing that's exciting about enterprise technology right now is after a period of time when there was a diminution of engineering and architecture. Because you go back 10 years ago, many companies said, "Oh, the technology stuff, that's commodified. We want to ship that off to a low-cost location. We're going to retain project managers." Well, that didn't work out so great in many cases. And I think many companies are realizing how important architecture and engineering are and how critical that is to their ability to get value from digital technology.
Yeah. So we talked about technology partners, but all eyes right now are on the supply chain. And so often, when we talk about cloud, it's about, enabling proper access even from external partners. How does this approach help with that challenge that I think so many enterprises face right now?
Yeah, it has multiple dimensions. Along one axis, your cloud services are part of your supply chain.
Yeah.
Right. And I would say in some, when you're talking about cloud infrastructure, the major cloud service providers, I would say the evidence indicates that there's less risk, much less risk from a technical compromise of the service than from misconfiguration. It's a little bit different with software as a service, right? Because your major cloud provider is spending hundreds of millions of dollars on security. On the other end, your SaaS provider could be a very sophisticated technology provider that also spends hundreds of millions of dollars on security, or it could be a relatively nascent institution that doesn't even have a CISO. So as you think about the full range of cloud services that you use at different levels of the stack from the different technology providers, you have to think about, okay, where's the risk actually, right? And which are the companies you need to spend more time interrogating versus not. Second, to your point, even cloud is also an enabler of the supply chain and a way that you interact with many of your suppliers, whether the business process outsourcers, IT outsourcers, advertising agencies, whomever you might be exchanging critical data with. And in this is the case where identity and access management is often the perimeter, right? And getting that right and understanding your identity and access management policies and being able to enforce them again in a security as code type fashion enables you to get at least some degree of control over your supply chain from a security standpoint.
Yeah. So how does this concept or this approach scale? Is this really like catering to smaller organizations, or is it a similar scenario for the large enterprise?
It actually worked better. I don't want to say better, but works as well, if not better, for larger institutions, right? Okay. Because once you think about building internal products around security, and once you think about investing in engineering for automation, larger institutions have an advantage because they can amortize those investments over a broader range. Over a larger cloud environment, over a larger number of applications. And in some cases, we're seeing a divergence in some sectors between those companies that can afford to hire dozens or hundreds of security engineers and those that cannot. And I think what you'll see over time is this divergence will drive more of the smaller companies to leverage even more from the cloud and more things further up the stack, because they'll have fewer resources, relatively speaking, to engineer the underlying security services and the underlying provisioning services.
Yeah. So where, we talked about how misconfigurations are running rampant and a cause of so many of the challenges in cloud security. Are there any areas or pockets where this is happening, where this is really the approach, whether it be industry verticals, or are we at the front end of this evolution?
We're very much at the front end of it. End of this. I'm personally seeing more in banking. Okay. Obviously, technology companies I think are doing more of this, or the born digital companies are doing more of this. They necessarily had to, but we're seeing a lot of early adoption in banking. Okay. Given the intensity of the risk and given the level of regulatory scrutiny, and as well as given the scale of the expenditures.
Right, absolutely. And they do tend to be at the front end of a lot of the best security practices out there.
Exactly so.
So where do they begin? Where does it come in? If you were to say, they are either perhaps that business, mid-size, large, looking to make the transition to the cloud. The most are there to some degree already. Or those who are trying to fix their infrastructure and really kind of close the gaps where they talked about where do they begin? What are the steps they need to take?
Yeah, I would say there's a series of steps. So first off, you really need to think through what your policies are going to be in the cloud, because they may be, in some cases they'll be the same, in some cases they'll be different, given a different level of risk and a different technology model. Then you need to figure out what the business rules are for applying those policies to different types of applications and different types of quote unquote deployment models, whether it's SaaS or a cloud service consumed at a lower level in the stack, whether it's cloud infrastructure or what have you. Then you need to think through what the overall cloud architecture is, right? And some of the tools may be the same, some may be analogous, and some things will be new. For example, one of the things we see of as at the heart of security at security as code or policy as code is a cloud governance engine that can check whether whether systems you're implementing in the cloud conform to your policies. Then you need to think through the automation use cases. What are all the things that developers want to do? Which of those can you and should you automate, and how do you need to sequence them? And then finally, you need, in many cases, a very different operating model where you lay out the responsibilities of the development team, of the infrastructure team, and the security team, where you lay out the organizational structures and the metrics, where you lay out the product model, and you start to think through the shift from, in some cases, is a reactive to a proactive engineering oriented skill set. And the only other thing I'll note is, as part of the operating model, it's especially important to think through the interaction between the security team and the rest of the infrastructure cloud team, because much of what you do to be secure now is less a separate technology and more a configuration switch or a configuration decision on a core cloud service.
Yeah, I was just going to say, a lot of what you're describing, does, and I made this reference to this phrase before, but involve a bit of a culture shift. And
absolutely,
there needs to be certain dynamics between teams and so forth. How much of the challenge is that? And do you feel like should there be a preparation for a little pushback as people try to take?
There's absolutely pushback. And one of the expressions we use when rolling out this type of model is change everything someplace rather than something every place. Okay. So pick a few products and change the organization so you're starting to operate in a product model. Pick a few development teams and have them change the way they're consuming security services. And that way you start to see holistic change in a relatively small area, and people believe it. They say, oh, wow, this is different, as opposed to just one thing, which doesn't feel like a sufficient quantum of change. Also, once that piece of the organization starts working better, you can use it to demonstrate to the rest of the organization, the rest of the people, wow, this is different. This reduces some of the frustration that you're experiencing, because many organizations we know of, or I personally know of, are frustrated by how painful it is to get things into the cloud and use things well in the cloud for security reasons. It takes months and months to approve a new service or to approve an application for adoption on the cloud.
Yeah, so almost a proof case. I develop a proof case that can then be kind of socialized through the.
And then you roll out in a cellular fashion across the rest of the organization.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, I shared with me previously, you all have a paper, is that right? That perhaps
that is correct.
Okay,
a number of my colleagues published an article called "Security as Code: The Best and Maybe the Only Way to Protect Your Business in the Cloud." And we can put the link in the chat, and also you can find that and actually all of McKinsey's publishing on cloud at cloud.mckinsey.com.
Okay, perfect. Wonderful. We are out of time. So I do want to thank you, James, so much. Really fascinating conversation on a very, very timely topic right now.
Terrific. Thank you.
And
it was great fun.
Yes, it was great fun. I'm sure we'll be back to talk again. Because like we said, the cloud conversation friends. So I do want to remind everyone that this session will be available on demand after the event wraps up. So be sure to check back for that and share it with colleagues. I do welcome everyone to visit the virtual expo hall where you can chat with sponsors, you can download take-home content and network with other attendees. Thank you all for listening, and I encourage you to stick around for more.